Hey, welcome everybody to our 22nd and special edition of the Men and Masculine Folks Kitchen Table Conversations today. Thank you for those who are joining us at this moment on a Wednesday at noon here on the 16th of June. Instead of our regular time on Thursdays at noon, we decided that we would have a special edition today with regards to having a special guest as well. Karen Nance, who is an activist and an attorney, activist with regards to child abuse cases and situations that actually happen in community. And she'll share more about herself later on, but I wanted to make sure that I also allow for both Sean and Serrano to share themselves before I go on about the conversation that we're going to have today.
Hello, thank you for having me. My name is Serrano Robinson. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm out of Duluth, Minnesota right now.
And hey everybody, my name is Sean Hayes and my pronouns are he, him, and his. I'm also up in Duluth, Minnesota, and just really excited for this opportunity to chat.
Thank you.
Okay.
And Sean is actually, for those of you who are joining us on Facebook Live at this moment, Sean is actually the one that will be communicating with all of you while he is also participating in the conversation. So definitely bring on your questions into the conversations and bring your comments into the question or into the conversation as well too. I'm sure Karen would be happy to actually answer those questions, or we would be happy to actually engage those questions and comments into our conversation with Karen as well too. So delighted to actually have Karen Nance, who is here, who has some historical family lineage and tied and connection to the Duluth area. And this conversation is very fitting to Juneteenth that is actually happening on Saturday, as we all know. About Juneteenth, it is a sort of momentous moment in the African-American community with regards to being able to actually move from being enslaved to being free. And it also comes at a time where we also acknowledge and we really want to honor that 3 Black men of African ancestry and descent were also hung in 1920 as well too, up in Duluth area. And so that would be the conversation, and really appreciative of Karen taking her time to actually be with us in this conversation and really share about your experiences, particularly your family's experiences in the Duluth area, coming from a biracial family as well too. And I think the other piece that is important to also mention is that you also have a new book that came out, right? Which the title, if I'm trying to remember it correctly, is Did My Father Poison Me or Did He, right? My father poisoned me or did he? And so we will also make sure that we link that book and how to actually get that book as well onto the Facebook thread and the YouTube thread as well too. So for those of you who join us later, you can also actually get your own copy of the book. It's a very easy read book and it's a very interesting read. And so I think that that would be part of what we're going to be talking about. But I will give the platform now to Karen to introduce yourself, share more about your work and who you are and how you got to this place of being in Duluth this week.
Thank you so much for having me, all of you, Men of Peace. It's very much appreciated. And I thank DanSan's Creative for arranging this. So thank you all so much. My name is Karen Nance. I was born and raised in San Francisco Bay Area. My family, my great-grandparents are originally from not California, and they never reside in California. My great-grandmother was born in Sweden, and my great-grandfather was born in North Carolina. He's of African heritage. His parents died when he was very young. He actually went to school, grade school, and probably high school. I don't think he graduated in Burlington, Iowa. And when he was out of his teens, he moved to Minneapolis and had his first job at the Ardmore Hotel as a porter. And Inga Nordquist was 18 or 19 years old. Her brother was already living in Minneapolis. And so he sent for her so that she would have better opportunities in terms of work. So she worked as a laundress at the Ardmore Hotel. And that's how William Henry Ray met Inga Nordquist, and they married. And eventually, their first child was born in 1890 in Minneapolis. They end up moving to Two Harbors, which is north, for a couple of years, had 2 more children. And then their 4th child, Ethel Ray Nance, was born in Duluth in 1899. So my original book quest of writing the book about my grandmother was before she passed away in 1992. I had promised her that I would write about her life. She had a very extraordinary life. She was the first Black policewoman in the state of Minnesota. She was the first Black stenographer at the state legislature as well. And she worked with W.E.B. Du Bois for over 40 years. She also was active in Harlem during the Renaissance, and she worked with the NAACP in California to help Thurgood Marshall obtain funds to represent the armed forces, Black armed forces in Japan. So she had a very rich and varied life and traveled extensively throughout the United States. And so my journey started with her, and in delving into all of her journals and things that she kept, I found out that she had a sister who passed away when my grandmother was only 18 months old. Her name was Ora, and she was born in 1893, and she passed in 1900. So I had written a very short book about her life, and it was called, the first book was My Father Poisoned Me. And then I wrote the second book that was referred to, which is My Father Poisoned Me, or Did He? And that's where we are at this point.
Very cool. Thank you, Karen, for that extensive introduction, and to your family as well, and sharing your family with us, not only us, but with the people who are actually participating, watching us later on as well too. I wonder about, like, because you took a very interesting approach to the book. If we could talk about the book a little bit, meaning the second book that you wrote there, in terms of Did My Father Poison Me, or Did He? And that you had wrote it from the first person of each one of your family members in some ways. And I'm wondering and curious about how that came about, or what was the reasoning, because it did come fully alive when you're reading the book.
Right. Well,
It
thank
really
you.
made it alive.
Well, I have to thank Daniel of DanSan's Creative for the thought, the suggestion, and that's because when I wrote the first book about Aura, my purpose was to make sure that her life was remembered in some way. I have first cousins who didn't even know that my great grandmother, my great aunt even lived, because she lived such a short life. But in the papers that I have of Ethel's, she talks very fondly about Aura and the stress and strife of what was going on in the household. Being the fact that she was only 18 months old, I can only guess that she heard this from her mother and her older brothers as she got older, but she had very fond memories of Aura. So I wrote this book. I didn't even believe that it would constituted a whole story, but my editor said that because the focus of my later books are going to be about Ethel, that it should be in a different category, because it's actually more about Aura than about Ethel. So I shared this book with Daniel, and he said, did you think about the negative picture that you drew of Aura's dad? And honestly, when I wrote the book, I just used a lot of the journal entries that my grandmother had written, and so my focus was on honoring Aura and not really thinking about the implications of the other family members, specifically the father, and just putting that out there, that one could interpret what happened in that family situation, that it was his fault or that father was to blame. So I felt that in order to not necessarily to redeem myself, but to just paint a more full picture, because the story is told from the perspective of a 7-year-old girl who had both parents in the household, who had a house there at that time. William Henry Ray had purchased a house in Duluth, which was really unusual. And so by standards for most people of African ancestry at the time, the family was doing well. And so financially, economically. And so I wanted to give William, the father, an opportunity to give the audience, the readers, a different perspective. Not that it wasn't a sad and misfortunate situation that happened with Aura, but there are other ways to look at that scenario. And basically that was because I knew that I wanted to write the book, a Duluth lynching from a family perspective. And so I felt that this would be a way to introduce the readers to 5 of the family members to get a different perspective. And so that's why I wanted to write it from a perspective of each of the family members reviewing my assessment of how Aura died, and each of them having a different impression or explanation as to why I was wrong in my assessment about the father causing the death of Aura.
Yeah, I think it makes it really real in terms of that assessment that you're talking about with regards to each of the family member. I think about like in child abuse cases that we have seen and I have worked with for myself, is that it's so hard to actually navigate when the violence actually happens within the home, right?
Right.
And then it is believed perhaps to be committed by somebody within the home as well to a loved one. And families navigating that, meaning family members and individuals navigating that violence and holding their loved ones also close, but also accountable, becomes very complicated. And I think that their sharings and their reflections at the end there of what you wrote was really interesting to be able to see that dynamic play out the same way that it would play out in this day and age as well too. I think one of the other things that is, I think that it is important to note that we've alluded to, and I do want to ask, but I also want to make sure that Serrano and Sean also share some of their thoughts about the book as well too, is the complexity around race and gender, because we have a lot of those conversations on this platform, right? Particularly with regards to men and masculine folks in marginalized communities, in communities of color in particular. And knowing that your great-grandfather, William, was of African heritage and ancestry, who had then married a Swedish woman, right, who is lighter skinned and we would consider white skinned in this day and age. It was interesting for them to be living in the 1800s where there wasn't many states or many communities that were allowing for biracial marriages to actually be happening. And there were in fact states that had passed anti-miscegenation laws that's prohibited people from actually doing that. But I think Minnesota, if I'm correct, was one of the states that actually didn't fully enforce it. And so I wonder for William, his experiences in terms of navigating the complexities of wanting to be seen and read as a man instead of a boy, quote unquote, right? Because men of color, in particular, Black men of color and Black men who have African ancestry are not seen fully as men in this country and still aren't. And then being married to a white woman, woman who has Swedish ancestry. I wonder how he navigated all of that and trying to care for his children at that time, right? Because we see that complexity still existing in this day and age as well too. So I'll leave it there in terms of that question and where we can go with that. But I also want to make sure that Serrano and Sean get to share their thoughts as well too.
I can go with some like initial thoughts just right away. That first of all, that was a real book. I don't know, I loved it. It was like, it was just really the way it was told. It just had a lot of like logical, a lot of emotional. You definitely like I definitely swayed back and forth of how I was feeling as a Black man and as a person in this world. Because I'm an avid reader, but I find myself struggling with books because like they don't make me like feel enough or I can't think enough on it. But that book was like, and it was short, so it was just kind of like really compacted in a great way. I loved it. I think it definitely told that bigger story too. I think I liked that part that Daniel said about, because at first that's how I was feeling too. I was like really negative, like feeling towards the dad, because I'm just like, damn, like you just, hurting the kids, because I work with kids, so I like the emotion hit first. But then I had to like realize like just the systematic and the time zone that they were in. And even nowadays, it's like, not super safe for people. Like I had to think back 100 years in the
Right.
100 years ago how that is. I had to literally step outside of myself for a little bit. And was just a clarifying quick question, was William the other child too? Like he had a child named William as well?
Right. He wasn't a junior. He had his mother's maiden name as his middle name. So the father was William Henry Ray and the son was William Nordquist Ray. So he was the first child born of the 4 children of that family.
And that's interesting because like you really like, I love the back of the book where it shows everybody's perspective of what actually went on. Because William is actually someone that helped me realize what was actually going on. Like he helped me understand like that it was bigger than just like what the dad was going through, and even what the kids were going through. It was like systematic. Like they just didn't want to see people it just definitely took me through a lot of emotions.
Wow.
I think my initial thoughts are going to be scrambly, and that's okay right now.
Yeah.
Because it really just told like an authentic true story of what people had to go, like what people of color, like a specific man had to go through, and what his family had to go through, even being like white, right? Like even being somebody who wasn't African American, they actually still had to deal with the negative effects of systematic racism, especially the children. Just thinking about how like it's so real, how like the brothers were like deemed fair skinned because they were lighter, and how the people even told the dad that it was okay, it was good, like what happened to
Right.
or because she would have had that really broke me. I was like, what do you mean like that?
Yeah.
But then not even logically, I was just like, I understand, like I guess I was trying to figure out like what they were really saying, that it would be a harder go around for her in Duluth, America. So yeah, I loved it, and I think I'm gonna just leave it with, it definitely left me with a lot of emotions, and a lot of thoughts about what people really had to go through 100 years ago.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that, Serrano.
Yeah, I know, for myself, I was actually sitting outside yesterday reading it, and I know, Serrano, I had a very similar thing where I was really just trying to like think back to like, okay, to even imagine how different things were back then, just generally, but then like I think what kept coming up for me is like reading about the racism and the things that the family experienced, and also thinking about people I know today who are sharing stories of like very similar things happening here in Duluth, Minnesota. And so it's like sort of like the story sort of transcends time, in a good and bad way, because it's like how much progress has been made, right? Like there has been that. And folks of color, Black folks, Indigenous people in this area still struggle, to get funding, to get jobs, to find housing, all of those things. So I think for me, it was just like kind of like holding both of those, like the trueness of both of those things. And I know for me, one of the moments that really stood out to me in the book that actually just had me crying was like how you depicted Aura like helping the youngest kiddo when she was dealing with all of her ailments and being sick, and And there was this one scene where I was just picturing, you know, she was in the bed and the mom had come over and said, like, you know, I gotta make things better, or like, this is gonna be hard for me, you know, because dad and her husband, you know, and the violence that was happening there. And I can't remember the exact line, but it was something around, you know, this sister who had already died at this point, like helping her, giving her the strength to get up out of the bed and to, like, you know, get healthy. And that was like a turning point for that kiddo. And just like the connections that I think that we have with our ancestors, whether they're like, you know, here with us right now, like descendants, and also like those who have passed on, and how they continue to influence us and give us strength. And yeah, that was really powerful for me, as, you know, someone who lost someone really recently. It was like, I can still feel that person, you know, with me and shaping how I make decisions in my life. And that was really beautiful for me.
Thank you. So I did want to share that the writing process for me has been a work in progress. I wrote the first book, and then I had input from Daniel, which inspired me to write the second book. And then when I finished the second book, I said, there's something missing with William the father. I said, I didn't feel that there was closure. So I wanted, if I can, have the opportunity to share a couple of paragraphs. I ended his version with him talking about Inga, his wife, and taking in the children. So I just wanted to share, if I may, the conclusion for William the dad. And so I said, my children had fair to pale complexions. Aura was the least pale, and I loved to refer to her as my coffee with a little cream. All their hair textures had inquisitive wave patterns, leaving the uninformed to wonder if they were of Jewish, Native American, or some other ancestry. When I was present among them, they were tagged Negroes. In my absence, and when they were with Mrs. Ray, who was a Swede, they were ethnically ambiguous, and the stench of racism would often elude them. If placing blame on Aura's death need to be appended to a person, I will oblige my great-granddaughter for the sake of her story. If I had not been at home when the doctor arrived to attend to Aura and Mrs. Ray answered the door, he would have taken pity on this frantic woman desperately trying to save her child, and handled Aura with care and concern, the care and concern she was entitled to, and would have saved her life. The doctor disliked Negroes. He loathed Negroes and procreating with whites. He loathed Negroes procreating with whites because such unions contaminated and weakened his, quote, superior white race. And killing Aura meant there was one less nigger to contend with. So I wanted to give closure and like an ending to his feelings of, no, I didn't. He was a very intelligent man, and he didn't appreciate the fact that I would insinuate that he couldn't follow a doctor's directions, especially for something this important in terms of getting medication to his daughter who was dying of pneumonia. So he said, if you want to blame me, it's not because I'm in some way inept or not able to follow directions. It's because this doctor deliberately tried to kill this child because he saw me in the household and saw me as a threat to humanity, actually. And I wanted that feeling conveyed in the story as well. So I'm going to redo to add that portion to the book.
Yes, I think that piece that you just read there was so powerful in many of some of the conversations that I have with even men in my community, in the Hmong community, as well, in terms of being seen and wanting to be seen as a man, and yet be able to still be a father to their children if they had any, or be a good caregiver. And then how do you hold that in light of others not actually seeing you as such because you don't have the capabilities, right? And I think that so much of what we've seen in society these days is who qualifies to be a man is often white. Who qualifies to be a man is often somebody in his 20s or 30s or 40s who's very good looking, the ones that we see on the billboard ads, I always say, right,
Mhm.
is that is what we qualify to be. And those qualifiers, and then there's obviously characteristics that are attached to that as well. And it is in that navigation, in the complexity of navigating those pieces that make it really hard, I think, for men of color to actually feel fully seen and heard and succeed, right? And I
Right.
think that his response there, just Williams' response alone there that you shared, I think really highlights how he had to navigate for himself to be healthy and
Right.
for him to be a good father to his children, to be a good husband to his wife or partner even during that time. And
Right.
that everything that he was doing was against what society wanted him to do.
Yeah.
And it wasn't improved in any way, right?
Yeah.
That's like, sorry for my language, but that's what's like fucked up about systematic racism is it makes you play this, it forces you to play this role of guilt of just being a Black father. Because that's literally what I heard is like this man
Yeah.
literally was broken from being a Black father to two half Black and half white children,
Mhm.
to four children. And that's just, it's so sad. Like that, it literally is like, and I don't want to make it seem like this is like fun, but it's like a game. Like they put the chess pieces in the right places to make you feel like you're not adequate to even be a father or a man nonetheless. So even he was even taking out his daily angers of not being adequate to the
Yeah.
white man on the children and on his wife. And it just really showed like how that as a game, as a system can just suck you in and run you dry of your emotions, of your awareness, like of the people around you. You're just literally hopping to survive
Yeah.
for the moment. And it was really sad. So I really appreciate just that last part you gave of even him just being able to speak that piece. Cause yeah, it definitely sounds like he even himself like blames him just being a Black man in white America simply. And there's some things that we feel guilty even to this day. Like, am I doing something wrong being a Black man in white
Mhm.
America? No, no, you're not. But and I don't say that because it's easy. It's not. It's really hard to have that realization that you're not a problem in America in general, in this world, in this universe, in this energy. But it's a game, and it's it really showed in a specific way.
Thank you for sharing that.
I wonder about going on a sort of a different track here, Karen, is that I know that you've done a lot of work around child abuse, and some of that is highlighted in the story as well too, in terms of the violence that the children had experienced from their father. To Serrano's point there, um, what, if anything, have you thought about how men and masculine folks, as we engage them in the work that we do, and as they are listening to this conversation, how should they be showing up and participating in ending child abuse when it actually happens, right? Like, what would you be sharing or would want to share with men and masculine folks across the state um, about how they should show up? Because child abuse, in some ways, exists by itself, and in some ways, is very connected to domestic violence that happens in the home and sexual violence that actually also happens in the home as well too, right? In fact, some sexual violence is actually child abuse.
Right.
Mhm.
So the first thought that comes to my mind is to the extent that it's possible in people's communities to get in touch with organizations and become members of organizations of men that are similar to men as peacemakers. That's number one, because there are resources that are already in place for you. If that's not available, then the second thing I would say to become aware, there's literature out there. There's a book by Stacey Patton called Spare the Kids, Why Whooping Children Won't Save Black America. And it talks about how in the Black community, that's the form of discipline, or has been the source of discipline for years and years. And she gives a scenario as to why that is, because of race, because of racism, because of slavery, and tries to offer alternatives to that. So if there's not an organization in their immediate area, but now I'm not going to say thanks to COVID, but because we can appear virtually and become involved in organizations virtually, that would be what I would suggest. But actually having a community to support and be able to share their experiences with similarly situated people, it would be huge. In addition, I think that what's missed a lot of times is the concept of the adverse childhood experiences that are disproportionate with people of color compared to whites. And that is, for people that don't know, is that there are what's called 10 ACEs. There are 3 categories that all of us can be, quote, tested on to see our level of trauma that we've suffered. And this is from birth up to 17. And so the 3 categories are abuse, which would be physical, emotional, or sexual; neglect, physical or emotional; and then household dysfunction is like mental illness, incarcerated relatives, mother or father treated violently, substance abuse, and divorce. And so unfortunately, people of color have at least one, of these 10 ACEs. And when I even look at my experiences and my growing up, I said, well, let me take the ACE test. And I have at least 4. And I think that as not only people of color, but people serving people of color, we just need to be aware that trauma didn't happen at our birth. It's generational trauma. And so just an awareness that I'm not in this alone, that I have committed a wrongdoing. Just because I might have committed an egregious act, that doesn't define who I am. And I had the privilege, and I do consider a privilege, in working in a state prison for over a year in a program called Victim Offender Dialogue, where we would meet weekly and go through a program, just like AA and other different programs have chapters that you go through. And the men that I was working with, and I did have a co-facilitator, we worked with each of the men in a circle, restorative justice circle, and all of them were lifers. All of them were serving life. Luckily, a lot of their sentences were commuted, and some of them actually have been released, and that was only in 2019. But to look at people as individuals, and to understand that they are not their worst crime, that they're not their worst action, and to help them to see that where this initiated, it might not even be something that they can actually pinpoint and say it's my mother or my father or the people that raised me, that it goes beyond that. And I have to admit that I learned, I think, as much or more than they did in being in the process. The other issue that I found, however, is that being an outsider, that I can't sit in their shoes, but also realizing that there's a disparity. There's power in the disproportionality of doing this type of work. And I think a lot of people who do serve don't realize that you're coming from a position of power, and you need to understand that. And to the extent that you can equalize, that you need to be aware of it. And it's more important to be a listener and a supportive individual, as opposed to coming into any type of setting and acting like I have all the answers, because the best you can do is have the questions and try to help people steer them where they can get the answers, and not as the I don't know, heaven sent person to solve all these people's problems. And so it was a very humbling experience for me. And the challenge was, people in the field of restorative justice, a lot of them come from a different perspective, and not a great perspective, and can cause more harm than good.
Yeah, I think that's it resonates a lot what you share there, Karen, especially to the point where you were talking about looking at the individual fully, regardless of, and of the choices that they make, right? So even though perhaps, for example, your great-grandfather, William Ray, may have made the choices that he made, he doesn't signify and say in the eyes of his children
Right.
towards the end in their assessment, that doesn't make him a bad father.
Exactly.
Like that they're not going to dispose of him, and they're not
Yeah.
going to just say, hey, come and hang my father, right, quote unquote,
Right.
or sentence him to death the way that he should be because of the choices that he made, right? And I think that that's the complexity that we hold, I think, when we look at alternatives to the criminal justice system in communities of color that we've seen, particularly like in even within my own community too, is being able to know that the men in our community are not disposable. They may make choices that are harmful and can make choices that are harmful, but that does not necessarily mean that we should totally throw them away in that kind of a way, in the way in which we are all taught in the society in some ways, perhaps, to understand that justice means locking somebody up or sentencing them to death row, right?
Mhm.
And I think I clearly hear that in the responses and in the reflections from William's children,
Yeah.
in the way in which they were talking about who he is and how he may have, and then they highlighted all of that, right? They highlighted how he was moving to Serrano's point earlier in terms of how he may have used violence and could have used violence and was violent in the home. And then to the point where he was actually a good father as well too, who
Yeah.
were reading and taking care of them and working hard to raise his family in conditions where, again, the environment wasn't conducive
Right.
to him being successful or his family being successful.
Yeah.
I think like what people fail to like realize, or what I'm like understanding is like, to him that was his like version or level of like safety in the home. I think that's like whether we can, right, whether we deem it or consider it right or wrong, like that was his way of like being able to protect them from the and that's fucked up, because that's exactly how a lot of like African American parents like, or just homeless work, that like, we got to discipline you in here because life is going to discipline you more. Even down to sadly like a pit bull dog, you're like, I got to discipline you more in the home because if you go outside, they look at you worse there. So damn, I have to like think about that. And it's I like that you bring up like generational trauma because of two reasons. Like I will always wonder, like when I was in school, and I don't know why, obviously in school in white America, they love to show you slavery videos during February instead of the contributions and the connections paving the way in those things. But that's what I do with the youth now, is to tell them about the real. But when I was a kid, I always wonder, like, why the fuck am I so sad? Like, why is this shit hitting me so much? Like, there's a reason why I turn in these people who identify as like white or not, like phased by it. It really is a generational feeling. And the other reason why I say that is because the other reason why I appreciate you bringing up the generational trauma is because when I talk with the youth, or in general with anybody, I'm like, I don't believe that nobody wakes up and decides to be like miserable or decides to be violent. I don't think nobody, not a fucking single person on this earth, I think decides fully that. It's everything that they're actually dealing with, their way of responding, the moment in time, who they're around, if they have support, if they have coping mechanisms or coping skills, do they have people that they can go to? So I'm not like, I've always been a person, like once I hit a certain age, I'm just like, damn, because I realized even when I did wrong, like it wasn't excusable, but it also meant that I was going through a lot at that moment in time. So I fully don't believe, even till I die, that nobody, I don't care who you are, nobody like gets up and decides like, all right, I'm gonna just be, harmful, or, I'm gonna just be a person that's like harmful based on what's happened to me. Like we all just either like, that's our way of dealing with it. We're not dealing with it. We're not realizing that that's the trauma and that's the stuff kind of like coming out as like our pores and stuff. So I really appreciate you bringing up that generational trauma, because sometimes like people aren't even aware that they're like snowballing it, for lack of a better term.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that that's so true, Serrano. In terms of like the snowballing part, particularly for like men and masculine folks. And not realizing it, right? Not realizing it, and everybody around you is being impacted by it. And we can hear that in William's children sharing the story as well too, is that there's some of that was happening with William, and his children was sharing some of that as well too, but him not recognizing that. And I think that it wasn't exactly to Serrano's point that I don't think, men wake up and masculine folks wake up, even men who commit harm, wake up and say, this is the day I'm going to go to jail.
Right.
This is the day I'm going to do this act, right? Very few, I would want to believe that very few, obviously we have the very few and the ones who are on the outskirts, quote unquote, the small percentage of men who are like, obviously the serial killers and things like that. But I want to say that a majority of us don't wake up and say that this is what we're going to do. Somehow we get to that place and we believe that that is the only choice, because that violence is the low-bearing fruit that we have to make in that moment, that we can choose in that moment, because we are at our own wit's end. So I wonder about support systems for that perhaps your great-grandfather, Karen, may have had for him as a man of color in that during that time. Like, who was he connected to in his support system, or was there just none? Because even to this day and age, for men to seek support and to get support even from their male friends is very few and far in between, and I wonder if you have any insights about that.
Right.
For your great-grandfather.
I do, and I did want to comment on the phrase hurt people, right? And so I think that with every situation we look at, when we look at someone who's committed a crime or has harmed someone else, most probably you can search back and find when they were harmed. And so I think that that's huge. So I thank you, Serrano, for that. With regard to William, he was active in the Masons, and it appeared that his dad, when he was in North Carolina, had been active in the Black Masons. And so that was a support system for him, as well as the NAACP. And William was when he came to Duluth, there was an NAACP chapter in the Twin Cities. And so he wanted to establish one in Duluth, but the people of African-American heritage said that we don't have problems in Duluth. So by starting this organization in Duluth is going to cause unnecessary problems. And so he couldn't get the support. And a year later was the lynching in 1920. So then people were interested. They said, okay, now we see a reason why we need to have this. And he was the first president of the NAACP, or chairperson of the NAACP in Duluth. And even though he did start the organization, participation waned, and he was a follower of W.E.B. Du Bois, and had learned that Du Bois was going to be in the Twin Cities in March of 1921. And not only did William, but he also was very close to the members of the AME Church, St. Mark's. Even though he wasn't an active member, he did have fellowship. They were only 4 blocks from where he lived on 5th Street. And so they, at AME Church, they organized and decided that they would try to get Du Bois to come to the church and speak, to try to get people interested in the NAACP there in Duluth. And so William actually sent Ethel to the Twin Cities to hear Du Bois speak and try to convince him to come to Duluth. And Du Bois said it didn't fit into his schedule, but he had to ride through Duluth by train on his next destination. So Ethel rode with him along with some other folk, and she had been in Hinckley working after the fires of 1918. And so he asked her about Hinckley and the racism there. So by the time they stopped in Duluth, he did get off the train, and he did speak at St. Mark's on March 21st of 1921. Ethel introduced him to the congregation, and he gave his speech there. And so that helped revive the NAACP chapter in Duluth. And so that's when Du Bois and my grandmother's relationship began. My grandmother wrote that there was God to William, and then there was Du Bois. So he admired Du Bois, and so Du Bois actually stayed at their home when he came to Duluth. And so that was his outlet, the NAACP chapters, as well as the Masons. He was very active with the Masons. There were a couple of Odd Fellows, and then there was another organization, I think Prince Hall, fraternal Mason organization. So that was his outlet.
Yeah, I asked that because in a few of our conversations recently, it was that we've talked about how important and vital it is for men and masculine folks to actually find spaces where they can actually find care and support for their own navigation and striving to be healthy, and what it means to be healthy for themselves. I know you talked about it, and I want to give some time to really honor and lift up your grandmother, because a lot of what you were doing, as you shared with us previous to us going live, is really for the sake of a conversation and a promise that you had made to your grandmother Ethel, and really uplifting her as a leader in the community and a leader in society in terms of both civil rights and equity. And her being a woman made her not be seen. And so really wanting to give space and time in this platform for you to really share her story, particularly because she was also a writer and an assistant to W.E. Du Bois, as you talked about. And he was quite a prominent figure in society and in the African and Black community as well too. But the people around him, as I shared with you earlier, aren't often necessarily seen or heard at times. And we always think that these leaders are by themselves and these prominent figures are doing these things. But she was there, and meaning Ethel was there, and your grandmother is Ethel, and her story is much needed, and her story needs to be heard as well too, in terms of how she contributed to equity and liberation in this country for folks of color and women of color as well, particularly Black and African women.
Well, when I was trying to come up with the title, I initially thought it was going to be just one book, but her story is so vast and interesting. I said, okay, it's going to be a series of books. But the first title was going to be Ethel Ray Nance, More Than Just a Footnote. Because if you Google her, you will find probably at least 50 links where she's just mentioned a one-liner, Ethel did this, and I felt, of course, she's much more than a footnote. And I think that because of chauvinism and because of where we were in the early 1900s and where we are today, it's very difficult for a woman to be a leader. And either you don't have children. If you do, you're frowned upon by not being at home and taking care of your children. I mean, we can look at Kamala Harris, who doesn't have children. We can look at Condoleezza Rice. And to a large extent, my grandmother had two sons, my father and my uncle. And my uncle is 86 now. His memory's fading, but he has recalled that she wasn't there a lot. And so no one thinks about the father, if he was in the household, of him being gone. No one says that Martin Luther King, wasn't a good father because he wasn't around. But if Coretta Scott King was traveling, then I think today there's still that disparity. There's still that it's frowned upon that you're a woman, no matter how educated and progressive you are, you need to be at home. And so I think Ethel struggled with that. In addition, she had a mother who was from a different country who never really assimilated, a lot, probably because she lived with William in Duluth. And she needed her daughter with her. Her oldest daughter had passed at the age of 7. So both William, her dad, and mom always clung and wanted her to come back. When she was in Harlem, Inga got very sick, and begged for Ethel to leave. She was only there for a year and a half, so she wasn't able to find her full potential. And then she'd come back and she was miserable, and her mother said, "You're so miserable, you need to go back there." And then at the time, there were two Black magazines at least two Black magazines in Harlem. There was The Crisis and the I just lost my not The Messenger. It'll come to me, but W.E.B. Du Bois had one and Charles Johnson had the other. When she first went, she worked for Charles Johnson because Du Bois didn't have a position available. Her mother became ill. She went back home, and then there became a position available with Du Bois. And Charles Johnson said, "Well, you're not going to work for the rival magazine, are you? You know, and you're going to tell the secrets to Du Bois." And so she asked her father, you know, who was the wise one who read all these Black literary magazines, and said, "What should I do? You know, I'm torn. Should I work for Du Bois, who I've established a relationship, or should I go, or should I not?" He said, "I think that you've created a problem and you just need to stay in Duluth." And that's the unfortunate thing. And she wrote that, "I wish I had a mentor. I wish I had someone that could have supported me." And I believe that her father really was concerned. I've lost one daughter. I really want her to succeed. But at the same time, my need to have her close is going to supersede. And so she missed out on that opportunity, and always tried to gain different and varied opportunities. I did share a little earlier that she was the oldest graduate from the University of San Francisco at the age of 79, getting her bachelor's degree. And the literature, or the letters between her and Charles Johnson and William W.E.B. Du Bois was, "You're going to be a good secretary. You need to get your degree to be a good secretary." But she was much more than that. But during those times, we only saw her potential, or they only saw her potential as being a secretary and not leading a magazine or running an institution, and an institution that was considered a male or a non-gender specific institution. There was the Phyllis Wheatley House in Minneapolis back then where she worked, and that was okay. You know, she worked there, and the person who ran that organization was a woman, but not a non-gender specific organization. A woman couldn't run that. So there's that bias that was there. She never referred to it that way, but that's how, looking back, that's how I see it.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I
Sure.
think it's so important, you know, when we, because going back to what I was sharing earlier, is fitting for us to lift those leaders up in our communities who are not often seen, right? And oftentimes it tends to be the queer folks and the femme folks and the women folks and women people who are not seen and who've contributed so much to our communities and so much to our societies. And yes, you are totally right. She is more than a footnote, and she is more than a secretary, because she's left an imprint in a lot of ways. And so I think that it comes very fitting in this moment for us to engage and have this conversation with you. And really also, as much as we are talking about how your grandfather had navigated the complexities of racism and sexism in his lifetime, it was also really important to give space for you to talk about your grandmother, Ethel, as well.
Thank you.
I wanted to, because we're closing in on time here, have Serrano or Sean share any one of your last thoughts or summaries about the conversation that we had with Karen here. I learned a lot, and I'll have them share before I share here as well too. And then, as always, give closing thoughts to Sean. But before that, have you share any last thoughts, Karen?
Would you like me to share my thoughts? Or okay, thank you. I'm just very appreciative to have this forum. I've learned a lot spending time with the three of you, and I look forward to exploring possible ways that I can become involved. That's really important to me. I've been made to feel very at home by DanSan's creative, and Daniel and Sandra in particular. And I love the quote from Muhammad Ali, which is, serves to others is a rent we pay here for our space we take up on earth. And I believe that rent is due every month. And so in any way that I can contribute and help, I'm here to do that. And I just appreciate your hospitality and the opportunity to learn. So thank you for letting me participate in this session.
Thank you. Yeah, I can go real quick. I don't have any questions because I feel like I'm gonna just go straight into fanboying it, and then we don't have time for that right now. And definitely, I hope that we do get to have further conversations and further opportunities to connect. But my last thoughts were just thank you again. I'm completely blessed to have read a story, to be an African American man, and to be born and raised like in a place like the Bronx, New York. I've like definitely had to inherit and shed between the two a lot of like either damaging or helpful survival tactics like coming up as a kid. So it was great to see another connecting story, one that took place like 100 years before like our time too. And yeah, I just hope that like a lot of people get to read that book and they get to take like the systematic like part out of it. I hope people aren't like too down on like how y'all said, down on like the father, and they understand like what it actually means. Because even me, I don't know what it means to be a man that's Black in 1900s. I know what I know how it is from 1995 and above. You got me, you know. But other than that, I even have to take that seat back and be like, I can't sit here and tell you right from wrong or explain like I know, because I don't. You know, I was born 95 years later, so I just hope that everybody takes the full approach to the book. And yeah, I hope you're able to keep telling that story to different people who need it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Just want to share that before Sean closes us out here, that it was such an honor, Karen, to be able to be connected to you and with you from DanSan, and really appreciating him connecting us to you and giving us the opportunity to actually be in conversation with you, and for you to open up and share about your family's history in this kind of a way with us, and for us to actually have the ability to have an exploration conversation, but also allow for us to deepen community and build community, because that's actually what we want to be doing in this sort of a platform as we engage men and masculine folks to strive to be their best version of who they are. And so it's such an honor, and I really appreciate the conversation that we've had with you, and took a lot of lessons from it, that though as much as we've made gains and strides, it is your grandfather is still living with us in the lives of myself and other men of color who are navigating the complexities that we're talking about.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and I'll just say one more big thank you to you, Karen, for being here and taking the time, and to Daniel and Sandra and DanSan Creatives. We're very grateful to be in community with you all, and grateful for this opportunity for conversation. And that was sort of one of the last thoughts that I was thinking about was, you know, for me as a, you know, white-bodied person, I oftentimes will get stuck in this sort of analysis brain place, but it's harder for me to connect with stories and actually like listen deeply and imagine from that perspective. And so I think the story that is told in this book and the stories we've heard here today are just so beautiful and nuanced, and I think that it's really the only way forward for all of us to have these, you know, conversations and get away from the like I don't know, that analysis, that talk that we get into where it's like, no, we're missing the humanity piece here. We're missing the deep, you know, connection that we actually all have across communities. And so yeah, I'm just very grateful to be in this space with each of you here today, and thank you to all of you who were able to join us for the conversation, whether you're here now watching live or if you're watching this a little bit later. We're grateful to be in community with each of you. And a very special thank you out to our funding partners, as usual, Blue Cross Blue Shield in Minnesota and the Novo Foundation for their support in these ongoing conversations with men and masculine folks here in the state of Minnesota. So thank you again. And for those of you who are following our conversations, our next live conversation will happen on Thursday, back to our regular day, July 7th at noon Central Standard Time. Don't forget to like our page here and share this conversation out so more folks learn about Karen and her work and can connect to that. So thank you again. Have a great day, everyone.